Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we are tackling big, upcoming, and ongoing education legislation for Maryland schools. We're talking with Shamoyia Gardiner, Deputy Director from Strong Schools Maryland, and we will be speaking about the Kirwan Commission, about the blueprint for Maryland's future, and the work that Strong Schools Maryland has been doing. My goal today is to have this be a crash course in Maryland education legislation and what citizens really need to know about what's going on right now. So thank you to Shamoyia for being here with us today. And thank you to our viewers and listeners. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section and I'll try to address as many of those as I can. Okay, let's get started. So Shamoyia, tell me just a little bit about what Strong Schools Maryland is as an organization, and just about its mission and the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. And first, thank you so much, Janet, for having me here to represent Strong Schools Maryland. And thank you so much to your audience for participating. So Strong Schools Maryland is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that came about in direct response to the establishment of the Kirwan Commission in 2016. Our founder, David Hornbeck, recognized that this was an opportunity. This commission was about to make some recommendations that could potentially reshape public education in the state of Maryland. And in collaboration with some other education leaders like Taylor Stewart at Leadership for Educational Equity and many, many more, built the grassroots capacity of everyday Marylanders using a combination of their policy know-how to lift up the recommendations of the Kirwan Commission. So we are primarily fueled by our team leaders. We have them in, I think, 21 of 24 jurisdictions across the state currently, and they are our people power. It is the importance of folks saying, hey, our schools are worth investing in. What is happening now is not okay. That got us to the point where we are right now.
So just to our viewers and listeners, I just want to point out that Strong Schools Maryland is nonpartisan. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And one of the reasons I'm so excited that you're here today, because we are going to dive a little bit into politics and where the governor stands on this. And I think it's just important to recognize that, Shamoyia is representing a nonpartisan organization. So with that, let's discuss a little bit just about the history and what is the Kirwan Commission? So we did an episode almost a year ago about the Kirwan Commission, and we spoke to Cheryl Boast, who is the president of the Maryland State Education Association. But that was a year ago, and a lot has happened since then. So can you just remind us, what is the Kirwan Commission and what happened to it?
Absolutely. So the Kirwan Commission, again, established in 2016 by the Maryland General Assembly, and they had two charges. So it was a 25-member body, some legislators, education experts, researchers, representatives, and their charge was to, one, update the state's education funding formula, because as it was, Maryland was underfunding its public schools by an average of, I believe, $2.9 billion per year, which if spread equally across the state would have come out to $2 million per school per year in underfunding. And we also recognize that burden wasn't borne by every school system equally. So the first charge was to update the funding formula. The Kirwan Commission took that to mean to make it more equitable and ensure that those students all got their needs met. Their second charge was to create policy recommendations, to create a world-class system of public education in the state. And they determined that based on years of research looking at best practices in other states, other countries in producing high quality educational outcomes for all students. So it has been quite a whirlwind. There were, I believe, 3 years of meetings and hundreds of pieces of testimony from various advocates, including ourselves, our team leaders, and partners from around the state. It has been a very wild ride.
So Maryland used to have a really impressive sort of school standing compared to some of the other states in the United States. But recently, maybe even over the past 10 years, that standing has dropped. And I know that that was sort of part of impetus was to get that commission undergoing. And then could you tell us just a little bit about what happened to the commission? Sort of
Mhm.
the findings came out in terms of what needed to happen, and then where did it go from there?
Yeah. So the Kirwan Commission, it took several years. I believe there were multiple instances where the commission either had to push back a due date or push back the due date of a report because they were so invested in ensuring they'd done the appropriate research and were making the right recommendations. The final report of the Kirwan Commission actually came out in December of last year. Very quietly, not many people know it, but the Kirwan Commission was, as we know, the basis for the blueprint for Maryland's future. So from the recommendations that commission made, we got the blueprint, which has 5 major policy focal areas. The first is early childhood education. This is an investment in our earliest learners because the research shows and common sense shows that investing in high quality early learning opportunities is going to set students up for success. So we want to do that. The commission establishes very nearly universal pre-K for low-income 3- and 4-year-olds across the state, and uses a sliding scale and mixed delivery system to ensure that those services are rendered to students. The second policy area, and I can dive into any of these deeper at a later point, is ensuring that they're high quality and diverse teachers and school leaders. So Maryland's student enrollment, its public school student enrollment, is about 33% white, meaning that a majority of students in our public schools are not white students, but the majority of educators, including teachers and assistant principals and other school level staff, I believe about 70% are white. So just looking at numbers alone, we're mismatched, and we really want to ensure that students have the opportunity to learn from people who represent them and show them options of where they could be. The third
How does
policy
I
area,
just want to jump in really quick. How does that
yeah.
those numbers reflect Maryland's population? Um, are they reflective of the population, and the same, percentage of white students are going to public school, or are they not representative of Maryland's population?
I have not looked into that. I think based on what we're seeing, we know that the state of Maryland's overall demographics, I think we're closer to 40 or 43% for the overall population.
Mm,
So there are some white students who are not attending public schools, and we know we have
mhm,
a variety of many alternative schooling options, but we're focused on public school education.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just
Um,
curious if that was matching or not. So that's interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely something to look into there. And again, this is a part of the reason why we need the blueprint, because the fact that alternatives exist to public education says that something about public education is not serving all students' needs. And we need
Mhm,
to make sure that we are creating a system in the state, because we're all paying into it, that does meet
right.
everyone's needs. So yeah, the Kirwan Commission's recommendations in the blueprint are an amazing foundation for that, and we at Strong Schools Maryland recognize that that work is going to have to continue above and beyond this veto override. But I'll get back to the 5 policy areas. So the third is ensuring that there are more and expanded college and career readiness pathways. We know that we want to graduate students who are ready to go into post-secondary education and achieve their wildest dreams and learn. And we also are recognizing that plenty of students justifiably do not see post-secondary education as the thing they want to do immediately upon graduating high school or at all. And the Kirwan Commission's recommendations and the blueprint itself make it so that we are creating the career and technical education programs that, one, are aligned to the actual needs of our economy and our workforce, and 2, are providing students with interesting things to do and learn about. We're in the 21st century, and the offerings that we give our students have to be relevant to what's happening in the world. Beyond that, the Kirwan Commission's intent was that these CTE offerings and new post-secondary education pathways enable students to graduate high school with the credentials they need to be successful in that next stage. So if it's early learning opportunities, dual enrollment, AP and IB courses, the blueprint provides funding to support the implementation of those programs. And on the CTE end of things, the commission's intent is to make it so that when students graduate high school, if they have done an apprenticeship, if they have learned about coding for the second 2 years of high school, that they can then enter a job that pays them a sustainable wage without having to go to another job training program. Schools should actually be preparing students for the workforce. So the Commission's recommendations in that third policy area are really relevant now when we're seeing many people experiencing joblessness and the shifting of our industries across the state in response to the pandemic and more. The fourth policy area is one I'm really excited about. It is ensuring that there are more resources for all students to succeed. And though it is very blanketed language, this is where the Kirwan Commission's recommendations and thus the blueprint push Maryland a lot closer to achieving educational equity. So a couple of things happen here. The funding formula is updated, and it basically establishes an entirely new funding stream for schools. So it goes directly from the state to the school level, not the district, if those schools are serving large numbers of students living in poverty. There's a concept called concentration of poverty, which says that if a school has a student population in which 40% or more are eligible for free and reduced price meals, which is an indicator of poverty that we use in schools, that school has concentrated poverty. When you have schools with concentrated poverty, you have more needs. And the fact that they are compounding on one another means that the normal investment that we're getting from our state's formula isn't going far enough to meet the collective needs of the entire school. There is not one jurisdiction in the state of Maryland that does not have at least one school with a high rate of concentrated poverty, being 40% or more students on free and reduced price meals. This means that the blueprint has something for every single jurisdiction in the state, and we all stand to gain. Let's dispel with the myth that it's always Baltimore City and Prince George's County. It's not. We are all suffering right now, and it doesn't do to really mask those facts. So in creating a concentration of poverty weight in the funding formula, I believe Maryland is the first state in the nation to take a step towards addressing concentrations of poverty in schools in its funding formula. We are a pioneer for the entire country here. And that is one of the many reasons it is so important that legislators override the veto this session. Beyond that, that fourth policy area expands my favorite type of school, which is a community school. And basically, it's a school, any school can be a community school, where the students' non-academic needs, housing, access to food, socio-emotional and behavioral health, those things are met by the partnerships a community school coordinator establishes with organizations outside the school so they can deliver services to students and help them get on the academic trajectories that they need to be. Community schools are a fantastic anti-poverty strategy, and the blueprint takes it an extra step and also goes towards establishing school-based health centers within community schools. And there is a sliding scale. The goal is, I believe we want to get down to any school that has 55% or more of its students eligible for farms would become a community school. Right now, the threshold is 80%, and we're slowly working our way backwards from the most need, but this is transformative. I don't know that another state in the country has an entire community school strategy like this. And the fifth area, of course, because this is a lot of investment that we absolutely must do, but it is very expensive, and we want to ensure that this works, is governance and accountability. So the Kirwan Commission recommended the establishment of this new independent authority to look into the implementation of the blueprint, look into the work that local school systems are doing, evaluate how the state is administering funds, because sometimes that can pose issues for local school systems, and also to provide these expert recovery teams, which are basically to help schools at the individual level if they're having issues implementing some program of the blueprint. So if we're not seeing the outcome we want to see an ERT at the head of the Accountability and Implementation Board would go to a school and provide some supportive services, which is markedly different from the punitive approach we normally take, which is we take funding away from schools until your scores get better. So we're taking an entirely new approach to accountability in the blueprint, setting a precedent for moving forward, which is what we want to see in general in our schools and how we deal with students. And I could talk at length about this, but I'm going to pause here.
That's really, really helpful, just sort of as both a big picture, but then looking specifically at the details. So just to zoom out on the language just a little bit. So the Kirwan Commission was the sort of research body that put together the findings. And then from that came the blueprint. And the blueprint really goes through and creates a tangible plan in terms of
Mhm.
implementation. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Um,
Um,
So we already talked a little bit about some of this, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. So one of my questions is, who is impacted by the blueprint, and how does it impact communities, or even, let's say, counties specifically? How does it impact them differently? Because Maryland is a diverse
mhm.
state. You know, we have a lot of intensely urban areas, but we also have a lot of rural areas as well. And then it, you know, even geographically, it looks so different. You know, their population density spots throughout, and I think there's a lot of challenges that maybe one county is experiencing that perhaps another isn't. So, how would this blueprint impact counties differently?
Mhm. Fantastic question. First, I think we said earlier that we want to get rid of the notion that it's only some jurisdictions in our state that need help. All of our schools, on average, see underfunding, and there is not one school system in the state that does not have at least one school that is dealing with concentrated poverty. So that's a long way of saying the blueprint has benefits for every single jurisdiction in the state, period. Um, what we're talking about is an increase in investment. So the way that public schools are traditionally funded in the state, we like to say that it's a 50-50 split. The locals put in their share and the state puts in the other share. What actually ends up happening, and what is true of the blueprint as well, is that the split is really taken on a bit more by the state over time, and it becomes
Hmm.
closer to 60-40. So every single school system is going to see an increase in funding from the state. There are some things that had to be shifted. There are many, many teeny tiny, super duper policy wonky aspects of the funding formula, like GCEI, for example, or things that we use to calculate the relative cost of living in one jurisdiction as compared to another, and then evaluate what that means that we have to pay teachers, and then how much does that go into the per pupil allocation. Um, it's a lot, but basically what the commission did in first establishing that concentration of poverty funding stream in the formula is guarantee more resources to where they're needed, which we hope to see translate into obviously better educational outcomes, but also better working environments for teachers. One of the specific programs and intentions of the blueprint in the high quality and diverse teacher area is to ensure that they are better prepared to enter the classroom, so that they're not dealing with the classroom management issues they're seeing, or dealing with students living in concentrated poverty, which is an unfamiliar experience that a lot of teaching programs aren't really preparing teachers for. That's something that benefits every single teacher in the state, because it's deepening their knowledge and providing a more expansive view of how they can better serve their students and be better advocates for educational equity as a whole. Beyond that, the districts that are persistently underfunded and the ones that experience the highest rates of poverty, Somerset County, for example, I believe has the highest rate of student poverty in the state. These jurisdictions are going to see increased funding based on the new weights in the funding formula, that beyond concentration of poverty, say for low income students, students who are English language learners, students who have educational disabilities, we're seeing the base amount of funding for every student increased, which then increases the amount of funding that students get per weight. And I know, again, that can be very, very wonky, but this is just a longer way of saying that the funding formula gives more money per student on its face. And because of the multiplicative factors in the formula, will end up administering more funding to school systems. this is obviously critical for many reasons. We have different needs now than we did when the legislature passed a blueprint last session, but that does not mean that the recommendations of the Kirwan Commission and the actual policies implemented by the blueprint are any less necessary. We still need more resources for our schools. We still need to invest in early learning. We still have to prepare our high schoolers for the workforce. So yeah, that's where we are.
What does this mean for teacher salaries?
Yeah, so the intent is this really exciting thing where by full implementation of the blueprint, the starting teacher salary in the state would not be less than $60,000, regardless of where you live, period. So that is obviously a large draw, an incentive, and even, again, prior to COVID, before we even talk about the many things that teachers are dealing with right now, we knew that teachers were underpaid. We knew that they were spending out of their pockets for resources for their students, and this was due in part to the underfunding of schools. So there is one, the increase of the base teacher salary. Two, the Kirwan Commission worked really hard to establish a career ladder that, one, provides educators a pathway to advancement that's not just leaving the classroom and going into administration or becoming a principal, because not everyone wants to do that. Some people really like teaching kids, and they should be able to do that and be paid extremely well for all of the expertise that they've garnered over the years doing that and doing it well. So there is a career pathway that requires certain certifications to be met. One of the programs is National Board Certification, which is something that MSCA is probably a little bit better equipped to speak on, as they are teacher advocates, but generally is another benchmark. It is a test, it is a certification that teachers can get, and that says, I am more qualified to do this now. It doesn't necessarily have to be a master's degree, maybe if that cost is prohibitive for you, but says that this is a way you can climb, you can go forward, and you can get salary increases and new designations as I believe they termed it distinguished teachers and principals now. And then the bill also recognizes that the National Board Certification exam is still a form of a standardized test, and with standardized tests, we have issues of inequity. So in addition to that, they are providing funding for supportive services to help teacher candidates of color, those who are historically and disproportionately not getting these certifications and may be locked out of a new career ladder, giving them the additional resources and supports they need to be successful, and also requiring the state to report out on the data about how teachers are doing and how this is actually playing out. Again, this goes back to accountability, and that is so important, because we want to make sure that the investments we're making are working, and we're pretty confident that they will.
It sounds like this has clearly been well researched and really carefully laid out in a plan, and things like accountability is built in, and I think that's really important. It does sound expensive, and I think that may have even been a word that you said. What is the cost, and who's really going to be end up paying for this? And talking about the money, what does that actually mean? So what does it mean right now, with tax season upon us shortly, but then also what does it mean for our future? Are we going to end up paying for this? Or maybe are we going to end up benefiting from this, even though it has an upfront big price tag?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I don't want to shy away from the use of the word expensive, because I 100% believe that our children and our state's future are worth it. That is what it is to make an investment. We can put large sums of money away for a future and then give someone else the hope that they'll trade stocks on our behalf and make us money. But when it comes to investing in the young people that we know are going to make up our society, that we know are going to have to keep things going after we are old and frail, we can't shy away from that. So one, yes, we can't afford it. We need to. The impetus is that our kids can't wait. And frankly, we can't either. We see what happens when an educational system is inadequate. We see the increased social costs as a result. We see the increased instances of incarceration. We see the damage this does to families and the intergenerational impacts this has for years to come. And we have to be willing to put a stop to this. Education, and folks like to say it's the great equalizer. It can be if we make it. We haven't made it, and this is a necessary step to take towards really realizing that vision and coming through on a promise of all kids really deserve this. So the cost, $4 billion on average for that 10-year implementation, right? $4 billion over 10 years sounds like a lot of money. I don't have $4 billion, I get it. The state of Maryland does. Our operating budget is about an average of, I believe, $50 billion. So let's, one, disabuse ourselves of the notion that $4 billion is too much to invest in education. Two, the experts say we can afford it. So the Spending Affordability Committee in December issued a report, basically says, as things are, including the impacts of the pandemic and the expected ones in the future, the state of Maryland has enough funding to pay for the recommendations of the Kirwan Commission, the blueprint, through up to fiscal year 26. And that is really, really great news. It's not the full 10-year implementation we want, but that is fantastic news because we haven't factored in some of the revenue generating options that the legislature passed last session that the governor also vetoed. On top of that, we can expect that funding. Beyond that, we are getting hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government, as we rightfully should, in response to the needs that students and school communities have. But ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, let's pretend that that's not the case. In the blueprint itself, on the last 2 pages of the bill, there's something we like to call the King Amendment. It was introduced by Senator Nancy King from Montgomery County on the floor towards the end of the 2020 session, historic moment. And it basically says this: if the state of Maryland does not have enough revenue to pay for an increase in school funding through blueprint implementation, we pause. We don't do it. We don't torpedo the state's economy. We pause, we come back. There's going to be some clarification this year so that everyone understands that it's a 1-year pause. That's an analysis we do. The more technical language is if the Bureau of Revenue estimate projections from December are 7.5% lower than they were earlier in March, we pause. So that's a lot of ways to say, of course we can afford it. And we literally cannot afford not to do this. And if you are data heavy and really wonky and you want to know more about this, Strong Schools Maryland commissioned a report from the SAGE policy group, which was a return on investment study, which basically lets us know when we can expect to begin to see that return on investment from this investment in the blueprint. Those numbers were obviously prior to the governor's veto. So I think we're like maybe 1 year off, but by fiscal year, I believe it was 34. So a couple years after the full implementation of the blueprint would have been done, we will see a return on investment come back into the state's economy, and it grows every year. So it's a very simple question. What do you want to invest in? What kind of society do we want to create? And I am for the one that gives equitable access to opportunity to everyone and prioritizes our young people.
Let's talk a little bit about the governor. So you said that he vetoed this last session. And so that's changed sort of the plan a little bit on sort of how this would move forward. Could you talk about why he vetoed it? And then also he recently came out with his own education plan. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between his plan and the blueprint?
Mm-hmm. So on May 7th, 2020, Governor Hogan issued his veto of the blueprint for Maryland's future. And as we just went through, there is a provision in the text of the law that would prevent the concern the governor cited as his reason for vetoing from happening. In my mind, that means that the veto is not necessary. What also went along with that veto of the blueprint was $2.2 billion in school construction, called the Built to Learn Act. The Built to Learn Act and the blueprint were tied together. I cannot impress upon you how much 2020 was the education session. We were trying to get things done. So again, the governor issues his veto. I will maintain that it was not necessary at the time, but what that did was create a situation that we're dealing with right now in the legislature, in fact, and it's the fiscal year 2022 budget. That's the budget they're working on. there are some programs that need to continue to be implemented: supplemental tutoring instruction, the provision of more community school dollars so that school-based health centers and community schools can come online, early learning centers, the Judy and Patty centers that we have to invest in for kids to get a good start. We need to make sure that those dollars flow, and the governor's veto basically put a hiccup in the timeline and means that a lot of the programs that would have been guaranteed by the blueprint and protected, and the very blueprint fund itself, are potentially up for grabs, up for alterations. And Strong Schools Maryland and our coalition partners in the Coalition for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future are working really hard to ensure that that doesn't happen. The governor issued his budget, I believe on the 20th of this month, and it is not what we expected. We typically expected that he was going to zero out all of the funding for the blueprint because he, vetoed the full implementation law. We were not surprised to see that the governor said he needed record levels of investment in education. The secret is, like, any governor is going to do that because you have to increase education funding with inflation each year. So the next governor will also do that. But what we saw in the governor's budget is that he has moved around some of the blueprint fund dollars, which are only supposed to go to blueprint programs, and he's directed them to other things. The issue is these are some things that are necessary. We do have to address the enrollment loss that school systems are seeing because that's directly tied to the funding they get from the state. The question is, when Marylanders are so used to having to have conversations with their legislators about education funds that we said were supposed to be used for this reason, do we want to get into the habit now of dipping into those funds? Do we want to set that precedent? It's not a good precedent to set. There is an argument for it, however, and that's what the legislature really has to figure out. So they have a monumental task on their hands as a result of the governor's veto of the blueprint. They know they have to do the override, and they are committed to doing the override because it's more necessary now than ever, but they're also going to have to layer COVID-19 response on top of that. And also, you can't just start from where we are. We started from a place of inequity. We have to go back and readdress the inequity and build into that so everyone at least starts from the same place. And that is a lot of work for the legislature to do. So they've got until April 12th, basically. And if the governor had not vetoed the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, this conversation could be a lot less complicated right now. We'd probably be able to get to solutions that will have real impacts for students and school communities a lot faster.
So what is the timeline right now? So you said that we have until April 12th for all of this to be accomplished in the legislature. And then it's as early as February 8th that they could get started. That sounds like that's a short amount of time for a lot to happen. What are you guys expecting right now? What is Strong School Maryland expecting to happen in that time in terms of, is this going to pass or not? How's this going to move forward? And then what could implementation look like?
So I will start with, we are feeling extremely great about this veto override. We have spent this last year talking to legislators, reaffirming their commitments, and the resounding response we're getting is it was important then, it's more critical now, and we have to do more. We're great on that. The timing is a little concerning. If we had our way, and if the Maryland General Assembly only had to work on education, we would have gotten the override done as soon as possible. But there are real life things that we also had to consider. We didn't have the governor's budget at the time. The governor sets the budget, and that's honestly a decision factor that the legislature has to include. So even though we weren't able to get it done in January, we know that the House is expected to come back on February 8th, and we do hope that they will take up the override immediately upon reconvening. It is critical because we don't just have to override the veto of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Now we also have to pass technical companion legislation to the blueprint that'll adjust the timeline for implementation, because all of the dollars were thrown off with the governor's veto. The entire implementation cycle is different. And rightfully, some legislators are considering whether we front load some programs. Do we bring more community schools online faster? Do we expand tutoring so that it's not just protecting third grade students against that cliff of, I can read very well and I'm on track, or this is where I fall off? Do we expand it to all of our students? Because 10th graders need help right now too. So there are some more things that have to be considered, but that is where we are for the moment.
Okay. So last question, what should citizens do? So let's say you're now like, oh my gosh, okay, this is really important. I think that this needs to move forward. What can your average Maryland citizen do to help move this along if they're interested?
So the first thing you can do is go to strongschoolsmaryland.org or find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok at this point, everywhere. If you go to our website or wherever you find us on social media, there is an action to get involved. There is a tab with resources where you can educate yourself about some of the history and some of the things that are currently going on. And there are opportunities to get involved right now. So if you go there, you can sign up for our email list. We issue weekly updates to our team leaders and also just to the general public to let y'all know what's going on during the legislative session. The blueprint is our primary priority, but there are other education issues that we're working on as well, because we really have to get together around more in general. So there's that. You can become a team leader. We have a program where team leaders, again, multiple jurisdictions across the state, you get together, you get intel from us a little bit faster, you get resources to share with your community members, and you get to build your own capacity as an advocate that you can, of course, then apply to other issues. And then you have, of course, a direct line to Strong Schools Maryland staff, because we love talking to folks. There's a lot you can do. I think one thing that folks always underestimate is what reaching out to your legislator can do. Call them, leave a voicemail, send an email. They are always hearing from people like me who operate in Annapolis, who know their first names or their histories. And frankly, they're tired of us. They want to hear from real life Marylanders because yes, they represent us too, but there are so many directly impacted constituents whose voices need to be lifted up to this level. That's a part of the reason why Strong Schools Maryland, we pride ourselves on our grassroots advocacy building capacity, because there are hundreds of leaders we have who wouldn't have been doing this otherwise, but who have found that by setting up a meeting and having a conversation, you can have an impact on the final text of this once in a generation bill. And let me let you in on a little secret. Legislators right now, they're operating in a virtual environment. They are typically isolated from the general public. They don't get to do the things they normally get to do at this time of year. And it is a high pressure environment. Everyone is watching them, and we have more access to them. Outreach from a constituent who says, hey, thank you so much for your vote on the blueprint for Maryland's future. I appreciate it. I want to make sure that you're also voting for the veto override necessary. If you reach out and say, hey, the governor's budget doesn't have enough funding for education, I'd really like you to ensure that there's more funding for school counselors because students have expanded behavioral health needs. That's the kind of thing they'll lift up in a hearing and be like, my constituent said this, this is why I'm voting this way. You can be that difference maker. I promise they'd love it.
That's really, really helpful advice. Well, thank you so much, Shamoyia Gardiner, for joining us today from Strong Schools Maryland, and for talking to us a little bit about the blueprint for Maryland's future and the future of Maryland's education legislation this session. Thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners today. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. There will also be a link to Strong Schools Maryland on our website, so you can just go there and click directly and learn more about the blueprint. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in both video and podcast format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.